Hey everyone, and welcome to another Konoha Reviews. Recently Bethesda released the latest entry in the Wolfenstein franchise in the form of Wolfenstein Youngblood. Youngblood originally was presented as a sort of expansion type to the new Colossus, but later was labeled as a spin-off for a discounted price of $40. It promised co-op gameplay and a continuation of the story set in the alternative 80s. Unfortunately, Wolfenstein Youngblood turned out to be an absolute garbage game, not even worth $30 or $25 in my opinion. First, the two new characters, the twin sisters, are some of the most obnoxiously written and annoying characters in the recent years. They forcefully tried to make them quirky and funny, but it's anything but, and it is just annoying and makes them feel like traitor trash. The problem too is that in today's environment, people that dislike these twin sisters get labeled alt-right or sexist immediately, but that is simply not the case. Were these characters written the same and portrayed as twin brothers or a brother and a sister, then I would still have hated them. BJ Blazkowicz had a subtlety in his line delivery that was a sheer contrast to the violence that happened elsewhere. He seemed genuine when he talked about himself, what he fought for, and the people he cared about. In my opinion, Wolfenstein The New Order had a perfect blend between humor and dark, serious undertones. The new Colossus, although still quite enjoyable, went a little bit too far in the humor department in my opinion. But with Youngblood, they go even more down this humor route, and it simply does not fit a Wolfenstein game. And that is just a gripe with the two characters. Other problems are the lack of story, the repetitive gameplay and backtracking with uninteresting fetch quests, the annoying spongy enemies with health bars above their head, or the stupid implementation of different armor types that only can be countered with certain ammo, so you're constantly forced to switch weapons. Youngblood luckily gets recognized by most as a bad game, and thus I have read multiple people yearning back to the days of Return to Castle Wolftenstein, which was released back in 2001. Now I'd never played this, and Wolfenstein The New Order was my first entry in the franchise. Return to Castle Wolftenstein was on sale on Steam for less than $2, so I thought what the hell and wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Now of course I did go in with some expectations, of which a few were tampered because the game is of course almost 20 years old. The game is very light on storytelling, but does offer a few cutscenes here and there to tell the story. The game begins with Blazkowicz being captured in the Castle Wolftenstein and you finding a way to escape from your cell. From here on out, you go on an ego shooter journey like shooters mostly were back in those days, meaning you were entirely on your own, shooting hordes of people, demons, or monsters depending on the franchise. You sometimes get cutscenes where some of the military higher-ups are talking and giving some background story, but none of it is memorable or deep, even for those times. In the beginning of the game, there were two things that jumped out on me. The first was how pretty the game still looked for a game this old, and the second was that it was not all that thrilling and I could not see why people praised this game so much. But this last part changed throughout as I played more of it. But first let's talk about the graphics. The game runs on an old Quake engine and surprisingly has a few bells and whistles that I was impressed to find in a game this old. One has to realize that in this year, Nintendo 64 games were still released, and this game showcased dynamic lighting, destructible objects and obstacles, pretty impressive visibility range, and textures that, though of course cannot be compared to today's standard, were not all that bad to look at. While playing this, I thought about how impressive it must have been were one to played it back in 2001. It would probably have blown some people away graphics wise. Now the one thing that I will say that has not aged all that well with this shooter is the actual shooting mechanics. Though the shooting itself is still fine and feels rather direct, the impact of the bullets on enemies is non-existent. Nowadays we are spoiled with realistic ragdolls where one gets hit in the shoulder or knee, but back in those days there were none of that. You just would spray bullets into the enemy and then suddenly they would just fall over and die when you had hit them enough times. Ironically though, a year later, Medal of Honor Frontline was released that, though not physics-based, did have the enemies react to every bullet fired into them, and therefore a game like Medal of Honor has aged better than this title in my opinion from a shooting perspective. Now back to my second notion that in the beginning I did not understand what all the fuss was about. The first few levels have you played through Castle Wolftenstein and is just your basic stone corridors and narrow hallways we have seen in so many shooters, even back then. The action was also very familiar with just shooting soldiers and officers over and over again. The lesser shooting mechanics made it to where I was not very impressed. The tempo of the game lay high and it took some adjusting at first, but it did not take long before I got adjusted. It also has to be said that I am simply not a fan of ego shooters. A game like Call of Duty or Battlefield 1942 are the ones that got me really into shooting because it felt like you were part of a bigger operation. I just get bored of most ego shooters as I'm doing the same thing over and over again, and that's what I got here too from the first few levels. What also did not help were the 2 levels that followed up shortly in the Crypts. These crypts were even narrower than the castle, and were bland in color and also had zombie enemies that, even though they were quite creepy, were not all that special. Though this level did not scare me, it did make me a bit tense, and one can definitely see why originally Wolfenstein was also known for a bit of horror elements in its game. So with the crypt section still being very standard corridor and hallway sections, I started to worry a little bit. But it wasn't until a tiny bit later that the coin fell and I understood the power about this game, and that is the variety in the levels and what you need to do. Now granted, this has been done in many other shooters, including Call of Duty and Medal of Honor, but I was surprised to find soon after a large open forest area where I had to sneak into a bunker via stealth and could explore wide sections in order to use flanking maneuvers in gameplay that felt drastically different than the missions before it. Though the action still feels a bit standard since you're only fighting soldiers, it does get more varied, as new types are introduced, including the paratroopers or the sexy Nazi SM babes that are an absolute pain since they can kill you so fast. In another level, not too long after, you are ordered to launch a secret weapons plane and need to find a certain sequence of switches around an airfield. Again, by today's standards, very vanilla, but it was so welcome to find a brand new area each time with new objectives to do. Another mission has you visiting a U-boat facility, or snowy and misty fields of Norway, or a secret weapons bunker where the Nazis are doing experiments on their soldiers, creating them into monstrosities and monsters. Or what about a mission where you need to retrieve a defected scientist by escorting a captured tank, and even towards the end, a beautiful mansion and also a very atmospheric level through a German town where you need to execute high-ranking personnel stealthily. It is all varied and usually does not take too long. Each mission can easily be completed in between 10 and 15 minutes, and therefore the campaign, which consists of 26 missions, can be completed in under 4.5 hours during your first playthrough without a problem. That would be my only gripe back in the day, namely that the campaign that short would not be worth $50. Luckily, there is some incentive to replay the levels, since there are many secret chambers and treasure to find, and also a multiplayer mode that I think does not really work anymore. The enemy variety is also great here, and is a real testament to how carefully crafted this game is. Again, in the first 3 levels, you will only be fighting the same types of soldiers and officers. Then afterwards in the crypt, multiple types of zombies get added as well. And as you progress more and more, they get crazier and crazier and also much tougher. From the earlier mentioned babes and paratroopers, to the electric mutants that walk on their 2 arms, or super soldiers that are RoboCop versions of German soldiers. This does help to keep the shooting action fresh, despite the shooting itself feeling withered. The earlier mentioned tempo of 10 to 15 minutes per level does help, despite still being too short for $50 back in the day, with keeping everything feeling so fresh and entertaining. You can easily play this game for a short half hour and finish 3 to 4 levels and feel like you've done many different things and experienced many different fights with varied enemies. It is a perfect game to let off some steam and get that adrenaline pumping. The game is also quite challenging, as automatic healing was not a thing back then. The F5 quick save button is your best friend, and you will need to use it a lot, especially towards the end. The game also has some awesome boss fights, though I thought the final boss, a resurrected evil knight, was a bit too easy despite looking really cool. I barely got hit by him, and he just has an incredible amount of health, so it takes a while to take him down. My final bit of a letdown with the game is again with the storytelling. The game basically tells the story of the Nazis trying to resurrect the powerful knight in order to claim dominance over the world. But this project does not get highlighted all that much or be presented with much depth in the cutscenes. It is a shame since the many missions feel more like separate adventures than one coherent story. But in the end, I had an absolute blast with the game, and I've completed it in 2 days and always wanting more when I put the game away. In my opinion, it has a bit of a standard and slow start in its first 30 to 40 minutes. But things pick up afterward and get crazier and crazier and never stop being awesome. I can happily say that this game did indeed give me a much better time than Wolfenstein Youngblood did, and just for a fraction of the price. In the end, I give Return to Castle Wolfenstein an 8.1. Please do yourself a favor, and instead of checking out Bethesda's latest Wolfenstein game, take a trip down memory lane and play this absolute classic. The high tempo and variety of the levels and action still holds up today, though maybe not presenting anything special, but that's not all that bad. It is a shame that the Wolfenstein franchise has gone down the drain, with becoming more slapsticky each part, and let's hope that in a few years or so, Wolfenstein will be resurrected again to his former glory.